Welcome to the best in paranormal talk radio, Darkness Radio. I'm Tim Dennis in for Dave Schrader, who has the night off. Want to remind you real quick that it is Friday night, and unfortunately, first hour of Coast to Coast AM is not going to be on our station. We have some paid programming, but you can catch it by going to iHeartRadio and maybe searching the LA market. That's just just a quiet little from me to you. I know we've had some people ask about it. Also, if you go to darknessevents.com, you'll see that there's a trip up right now to the Palmer House Hotel, one of the most sought-after haunted locations in the United States. It's in our very own state, in Sauk Center, Minnesota, and we're returning there for a haunted weekend in February of 2017. It's myself, Dave, and Bill Chappell, and it's going to be a great weekend in late February of 2017. Spots are going quick for this, folks, and there's limited spots available. Go to darknessevents.com, click on the banner with all three of our faces there. Michael and Marty Perry will be having a psychic gallery session there as well. That price is separate from your ticket price. We have weekend passes available. Single day passes are available as well. Brand new workshops and brand new equipment as well. Bill has invented some new stuff that you're going to want to check out. And it's all going down that weekend in February. And there's also single day passes as well. Just a reminder that rooms at the Palmer will be available for people who have weekend passes. So you're going to want to get those weekend passes if you can right away. The rooms will go to people with weekend passes first. So go to darknessevents.com, click on the banner, get your tickets right now. They make great holiday gifts. Let's get into our guests, shall we? In hours 2 and 3, we'll have John Zaffis and Rosemary Ellen Guiley with us. And John has a brand new book out called Demon Haunted, True Stories from the John Zaffis Vault. We'll be talking about John's life and a little bit about Ed Warren and his communication with Ed from the other side. That's coming up in hours 2 and 3 tonight. In hour 1, we've got Joshua Cutchin with us tonight. He's got 2 books out there. He's got The Brimstone Deceit, an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous, I believe it's miasmas. I'm going to ask him how to pronounce that because I'm not the smartest guy in the tree. And A Trojan Feast, the food and drink offerings of aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch. I'm glad it's Sasquatch and not Sasquatches because some people don't know their grammar. We'll talk to Joshua about proper grammar too because I'm not one of those guys either. Let's bring him on the program now. Let's welcome to the Darkness on the Edge of Town Paranormal Radio Show, Joshua Cutchin. Joshua, I'm still in shock over the Vikings game yesterday. I got to explain to people that I expected at this time in the program that I would be a quivering purple mass on the floor crying for my mommy. I expected us to get blown out by 30 last night, and of course we didn't. We lost a close game, so...
Well, it always pays to have a contingency plan, right?
Yeah. So please forgive me. You are an author, musician, husband, North Carolina born, Wisconsin educated, which I apologize for. I know Wisconsin is the land of Packer fans and serial killers. So I know that you probably had a tough time there. But Georgia transplanted. So congratulations for that. But welcome into Darkness Radio. We appreciate you being with us tonight.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And you nailed miasmas.
Did I?
That was spot on.
Thank you, and thank you for not putting Sasquatches or Bigfoots in your book.
I hate that so much. There are plenty of other. It's the old Lauren Coleman argument. There are plenty of other animals where the plural and the singular are the same, like deer and bison.
Right.
Bigfoots just sounds so. It doesn't sit in my mouth very well.
Right. And every time I hear Bigfoots, I cringe. It's not a word.
Yeah. I hate it.
Yeah.
Hate it.
Yeah. And thank you for agreeing with me. I appreciate that. I got to ask you right off the bat, you have 2 very unique book subjects here. First of all, let's just right off the bat, let's ask you about both. How do you come to these subjects? What kind of tickled your fancy to get you to write about both these subjects?
Well, I always had a real interest in these sort of Fortean anomalous topics, and it was never really discouraged in my household growing up. They were always, as long as you're reading, who cares what book you check out? So this is a long-standing interest that I've had, but I came back around to it about probably 3 or 4 years ago now, Um, one of my biggest interests that I've always had are the similarities rather between fairy folk and a lot of modern day abduction phenomena. That sort of Jacques Vallée analysis of the phenomena, where you see parallels between the fairy folk legends of yesteryear, which are a worldwide tradition, and modern day abduction lore. Fairies had an obsession with our reproduction by abducting children and replacing them with changelings. Aliens have, supposedly have this obsession with pregnant women and hybridization. And you have small entities accompanied by bright light. So I've always found those parallels to be really interesting, and that's where a lot of my interests have always lain. But it was about 3 or 4 years ago. I got back into the paranormal in a big way with just looking at listening to paranormal podcasts. I had a pretty long commute, an hour each way, and this was the perfect thing to fill up my time. And I ended up becoming really just back on track with the paranormal, as it were. So what I ended up doing is I remember distinctly I got an Amazon gift card and I purchased J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch, which is a great book if anybody ever wants to check it out. But there was a particular passage in there that really caught my attention, and I'll sort of explain why. In this interest that I've always had between the similarities between fae folk and alien abduction, I've always wondered if there perhaps was some expression of an older fairy belief in alien abduction, specifically that of the food taboo. It was a commonly held belief that if you were to take food or drink from the fairy folk in ancient tales, that you would be trapped with them forever. And I was, of course, aware that there are certain abduction and contactee encounters where people claim to have received food and drink from extraterrestrials as well. I wouldn't call it necessarily like a major motif in terms of the other stuff that you associate with, these encounters, but I definitely would call it a minor motif in terms of how frequently it crops up. But so I've got this rattling around in my head, and I remember distinctly that at one point in J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch, he mentions that if you were to accept food from the Bookwus, which was one First Nations tribe's name for Sasquatch in Alaska, that you would be trapped with the Bookwus forever and eventually become one. So that was one of those moments when I said, that's a really startling point of comparison, and it seemed a little bit too coincidental to really overlook. So I started digging on it, and I said, okay, well, somebody's got to write a book about this, right? And I waited, and nobody wrote a book. And I said, well, maybe I should just sort of keep on doing some research. And it really did spiral out into its own thing. And a year later, I had my first book, A Trojan Feast, written, which is about the tales where people encounters are either given or give, or they either take or receive food in encounters with aliens, UFO, aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch. And of course, to be clear, I don't necessarily know if those are. I'm pretty agnostic about a lot of these subjects, and I don't necessarily think that fairies are fairies, and I don't necessarily think that extraterrestrials are extraterrestrials or Sasquatch. I have some kind of heretical ideas regarding those.
Oh, what are those? I'm just curious.
Well, sometimes I wonder. So there are so many strong consistencies between these phenomena. I mean, I mentioned the alien fairy, the two sides of that sort of analysis, how a lot of the alien lore and a lot of the fairy lore tend to blend together. Mm-hmm. But I don't think people quite realize how the Sasquatch lore folds in as well. I mean, people talk about people who see Bigfoot and UFOs in conjunction as being crazy people. But if you look at the motifs surrounding these, I mean, there are plenty of stories where Bigfoot has an interest in human reproduction as well. It's been said that fairies live underground. It's been said that aliens have underground bases. It's been claimed that Sasquatch lives underground. We see bright lights. There's actually been sort of this ongoing trend that I'm noticing in a lot of Sasquatch circles, that they're actually starting to talk about the fact that at a lot of Sasquatch sites, they actually see glowing orbs in the woods. There are also some fairy Sasquatch connections as well that people don't really talk about. We think of fairies in America today as being these sort of effete Victorian, Elizabethan little pixies with wings like Tinkerbell, and that couldn't really be farther from the truth from a folkloric perspective. They came in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they were as big as human beings. Sometimes they were larger than human beings, such as the case of the Celtic woodwose, which was a large, tall, hairy wild man, which sounds exactly like Sasquatch. Another interesting parallel that people don't really address is that a lot of times sometimes people who claim to be habituators, who are in an area where they claim to have one or more Sasquatch on their property, will often leave trinkets or leave food up for the Sasquatch. Well, that's a tradition that stretches all the way back to the fairy folklore as well. And even probably the single most baffling thing, that's this little fairy Sasquatch connection, is the braiding of horses' manes. It was a very common thing, especially in the British Isles, to find horses' manes braided overnight, and oftentimes it was attributed to pixies or elves or something coming into the stable and braiding horses' manes. And in the modern era, you can find no shortage of people who claim to find their horses' manes braided, and also claim that it's Sasquatch doing it. So I see all these things taken in aggregate really tend to point me towards the fact that if we aren't seeing different expressions of the same phenomena, perhaps we are seeing different phenomena using similar methods. But I think that there is definitely a connection there. I think that there's a core to a lot of these phenomena that is, there is a center to the Venn diagram, if that makes any sense.
Makes sense. Let's take our first break of the program. Joshua Cutchin is our guest. The book we're talking about right now is A Trojan Feast, the food and drink offerings of aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch. When we come back, let's dig a little deeper with our guest, Joshua Cutchin, here on the best in Paranormal Talk Radio. This is Darkness Radio. I ask you what some people would call, it might be a dumb question, but Mama always said never give food to a stranger, or be afraid of who exactly you give food for, because they might bite the hand that feeds them. Are there negative experiences in the book of actually feeding an alien, a Sasquatch, or a fairy?
There are plenty. So yeah, that's something that I actually find really interesting about a lot of these encounters. If I were to walk up to you on the street and were to offer you some sort of food stuff, like, you wouldn't take it at all. But you have people in a lot of these encounters taking food of their own volition, which definitely suggests to me that perhaps there's some sort of altered state of consciousness involved. But the effects that people experience from a lot of these substances that they're given vary widely. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes they will suffer amnesia immediately following the administration of such substances. But it's not at all uncommon to find, especially in the abduction narrative, people who are sick upon returning from their experience, and they'll actually vomit up what they believe they had been given aboard a craft. On the other side of that spectrum, the fairy folk / Sasquatch offering sort of phenomena, because you don't find a lot of there are some cases where supposedly extraterrestrials and witnesses have exchanged food, but they're pretty thin on the ground. The fairy folk Sasquatch continuum of offerings is definitely one that is rife with peril. So in a lot of mythology of yesteryear, it was said that you could actually at worst avoid the wrath of the Fey folk, or at best actually enlist their help by offering them certain foodstuffs. But the interesting thing was that you had to get the exact preferred food correct. Sometimes if you actually gave them the wrong food that they didn't want, for example, I think pixies in Wales preferred milk. If you actually gave them the wrong sort of food stuff, it would actually be worse than not giving them anything at all. And sometimes you see that that reflected in some modern Sasquatch encounters as well, where people claim to have set up relationship. I found some stories where people claim to have set up relationships with large hairy hominids on their property, giving them apples and peanut butter once a day or something. Mm-hmm. And then they were hospitalized and they came back and all their livestock was killed. I don't know how apocryphal stories like that are, but it definitely is a reflection, or an expression rather, of some of these these common themes of being very careful with how you interact with these beings and sort of that food offering continuum.
Wow. Let me throw this at you too. I mean, with this comes a certain amount of trust. Is it safe to say that it's not safe to trust, or is it safe to trust in some cases when it comes to these beings, whether it be alien, fairy folk, or Sasquatch?
Well, I think that so it's interesting because the more I sort of looked into researching this particular book, the more it became very apparent that Sasquatch in at least in the context of these stories, was a little bit separate from the fairy alien sort of continuum
Mhm.
in terms of the frequency of food and exactly what the food was meant for. A lot of times when people claim to have received food from Sasquatch, they've been abducted by Sasquatch, in which case it's kind of your only option. But in fairy and alien encounters, you tend to see those beings offering foodstuffs, presumably to generate some sort of effect in the witness, because oftentimes these experiences, these encounters are quite brief. So it's not really necessary for sustenance. In that case, it was best to proceed with caution. The unfortunate thing is, even though you could be trapped with the fairy folk by consuming their food, if you denied them, that was actually sometimes just as bad or worse. There was a story that I found where a gentleman said that he had run into the Banshee on a lonely lane in Ireland and was offered buttermilk, and when he denied the Banshee, she actually smote him blind. So sort of a damned if you do and damned if you don't sort of situation.
Wow. All right, I'm taking a second to digest this. I mean, I know it's a pun, but
Wah, wah.
see, wah wah wah. But so you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You might as well just run, is what you're saying. Don't take the food. Don't not take the
Well,
food.
Well, that implies that there's an option. I mean, so if you look at sort of the character or the flavor, pardon the pun again,
Mm-hmm.
of alien encounter stories as they've been represented by witnesses through the years, they can roughly be divided into the contactee experience and the abductee experience. The contactee experience really reaching its pinnacle in the 50s, 60s, early 70s, and the abductee experience from the 80s on. And it's interesting to examine the manner in which those experiences are reflected rather in the sort of foodstuffs that are encountered in these particular experiences. For example, in contactee experiences, those were generally qualified as positive experiences, voluntary experiences, pleasant experiences. They would be invited aboard a craft by some sort of beautiful, benevolent space brother, and they'd come aboard and they'd be offered some sort of wonderful, delicious juice drink that tasted really sweet. By contrast, if you look at the abduction experience, it's always negative, often involuntary. Of course, these are broad strokes that I'm painting with here, but negative, involuntary, and unpleasant, forceful. And so in those encounters, you actually see a lot of force feeding. You see a lot of forced ingestion of foodstuffs, even if not forced. Often, witnesses are supposedly consuming these things under duress. They're being threatened with something if they don't consume it. So it's interesting to see that sort of expression of the character of these particular encounters expressed in that way. So I mean, who knows? Sometimes you might not even have an option. You might just have it, foisted upon you.
I'm curious as well too. You have food that's offered in pleasurable settings, like you just said, but then and you have food that when taken in is used kind of as bait, like you're mentioning, and used kind of to monitor, to see the reaction of a subject. But has food ever been used, especially in an alien setting, to change somebody's, I'm trying to think of the way to put this, change somebody's DNA, change somebody's outlook, change somebody's chemistry?
Well, it's interesting if you really look. So the short answer is yes. There are some witnesses, especially those who were a part of John Mack's survey, the Passport to the Cosmos book, who claimed that they felt that they were being given food and drink as some sort of super vitamin to help the alien hybrid that they were gestating. But what's more compelling to me and more interesting to me is if you look at the sort of foodstuffs, especially in alien and fairy encounters that are offered. They tend to correspond roughly to a lacto-vegetarian diet. So people will describe receiving bread or dairy products or grains or vegetables. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the prevalence with which these particular foodstuffs appear in terms of ranking them from most common to least common, it corresponds directly with a specific type of lacto-vegetarian diet, the Sattvic diet, which is the preferred diet of Hindus, who are mystics and holy men in the Hindu religion. What's interesting is that it's claimed by mystics in the Hindu religion that the very consumption of sattvic foods will actually help foster this enlightened state of being. It's compelling to sort of compare that to some people who have taken food aboard these craft and have come back with a completely changed attitude. One of the famous cases that I go over in the book is the Avis abduction. Elaine Avis and her husband were taken in, I believe it was the 60s or 70s. I don't have it off the top of my head. But they were taken aboard a craft by these owl-faced entities who offered them some sort of peppermint candy type foodstuffs. And once they returned, they completely gave up meat, alcohol, artificial flavoring, any sort of artificial foods at all, and they continued to correspond to a lacto-vegetarian diet. So it's really compelling connection there in terms of people completely changing their approach. Similarly, you see this expressed also in fairy lore, where people would go to these fairy parties, and they would come back and they would be completely fine until they actually took some dinner. There's a story that I ran into of two fiddlers who were taken into a fairy party. They went underground and they had some food and drink, and while they were able to return, they returned years and years and years and years later. They felt that it had only been an evening, but it had actually been decades rather, which is a variation on the missing time motif that we see in abduction reports. But these two fiddlers, after returning from fairyland, were completely fine until they had their first bite of a mortal meal, and that's when they crumbled into dust. So you do see these sort of expressions of these sort of Magonian experiences affecting people on a deeper level.
Okay, here's the obvious question in the room: if they're so high on a lacto-vegetative diet, what's with the cattle mutilations?
That's a great question. Yeah, cattle mutilations are something that in the book I sort of go right up to the edge of and can't quite come back. So when I say that there's a lacto-vegetarian diet component there, we have to work from a place of strength in terms of describing these things. I think if we are really dealing with extraterrestrials, which, as I've said, is something that I'm a little bit skeptical of, but if we are dealing with extraterrestrials, the idea that they actually have cows on board is a little bit silly. Mm-hmm. What I think is interesting is that if you look at the fairy folk in general, a lot of times they would have offerings left out by peasants overnight, and the offerings would still be there the next day. And the way that the peasants explained this was they said, well, the fairies did eat of this particular dish, but they consumed the essence. They consumed the foison, is what they called it, the foison of this particular offering. And anytime a house cat or livestock would ever eat some of these foisonless, these essenceless offerings that had been left out for the fairies, they always got sick. So I think that there's an interesting parallel in that when you compare that to the modern unexplained livestock mutilation phenomena, where you'll see scavengers actually avoid mutilated livestock. It's almost as if they know to avoid these carcasses that have had the essence taken from them. Again, it's an expression of this similar motif. I don't know how literally we can take that, but it is an interesting little through line between those two bits of folklore.
Very interesting indeed. Our guest is Joshua Cutchin. The book we've been talking about, A Trojan Feast, the food and drink offerings of aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch. If people want to get the book, Joshua, where do they pick it up?
It's available from Amazon and Barnes & Noble, courtesy of Anomalous Books, and it's in a variety of formats. A Trojan Feast is available in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle as well.
All right. When we come back, I believe it was Leonard Skinner that sang Ooh, That Smell, but we'll talk a little bit about the brimstone deceit and in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas. We'll talk about what exactly that smell is when we come back with Joshua Cutchin right after this. The same question I asked you at the top of the hour: how do you come upon the brimstone deceit? What was it you smelled that you thought, you know what, this is going to make an awesome book?
Can I say myself? No.
Well, if you want, sure.
So in this curiosity that I have in terms of sort of this pan-paranormal phenomena idea, I'd often found it interesting that there are frequent reports of the smell of sulfur. Now, just to be clear before we proceed any further, mm-hmm. with a title like The Brimstone Deceit, it almost sounds like it could be coming from a very strong Christian standpoint. Mm-hmm. While I am a Christian, I do not ascribe to the fact that all these are demonic activity or that it's all demons from hell or something. That gets misrepresented a lot when I start talking about this particular topic. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, you cannot deny that there are quite a few accounts, particularly in spirit cases, alien slash UFO cases, and Sasquatch cases, where there is this pervasive odor of sulfur. You'll find this odor as well in certain fairy cases, Men in Black cases, black-eyed children cases. It's a very, very common odor that you find. Now, to be clear, I don't think that it necessarily represents a majority of your of your paranormal odors. I think rather that, from what I can tell, it represents a plurality. So not only is it the most common in terms of being reported in all sorts of different phenomena, but it probably represents like uh, 30%, and the remaining 70% of smells are divided among 10 other subjects. So it represents a substantial slice of the pie. Now, what's interesting to me is that when people say that they smell sulfur, they're actually not smelling sulfur. Uh, Pure sulfur actually has no smell unless it's burned. When it's burned, it releases sulfur dioxide, which is that sort of gunpowder fireworks smell that we associate with. But most commonly, people are actually reporting hydrogen sulfide when they're talking about sulfur. Hydrogen sulfide is that rotten egg smell that we all think when we think about, oh, this water smells like sulfur, or the flatulence smells like sulfur.
Okay.
Hydrogen sulfide appears whenever you have the absence of oxygen and organic material breaks down. So it's interesting. So what I try to do is try to navigate a way to see if perhaps there was some sort of reason for that, or if not that, perhaps sort of catalog the similarities between a lot of these different cases where this hydrogen sulfide odor is so commonly noted. Because you do find it in cases of demonic possession. You do find it in abduction reports. They'll say that especially gray aliens will smell like sulfur, and you'll find plenty of Sasquatch reports that say that Sasquatch smells like a septic tank, which is again that organic composition in the absence of oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the brimstone deceit comes in, because it becomes apparent the more you look at this that perhaps that hydrogen sulfide is a compound, not to be coy about it, but hydrogen sulfide is a compound with some very interesting properties, not the least of which is the ability to, in carefully managed doses, administer a state of suspended animation in mammals. So I wonder if perhaps we aren't just, the smell isn't a side effect of something being used for a very specific end in these particular encounters. Having said that, the book is not just about sulfur smells in Magonian encounters. It's about all sorts of smells and all these paranormal events. So I go into the fact that apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary often have floral smells. Spirits often smell like smoke or flowers. There are a variety of UFO odors, chemical odors, cardboard odors, musty odors, and there are a variety of Sasquatch odors. Wet dog smells, ammonia smells, body odor smells, and really taking a look at each of these and what implications those might have for each of these separate phenomena. For example, with the Sasquatch thing, even though I do address the sulfur smells of Sasquatch, let's take a look at what, if somebody says Sasquatch smells like skunk, does that mean that there's a scent gland to Sasquatch? And really taking a look at that for the first time in a deep way, to try to see if perhaps we can't learn a little bit more about the phenomena through these tiny details.
Well, yeah, let's look a little closer at Sasquatch for a second. And you mentioned the scent gland idea, and that the fact that Sasquatch and skunk ape are maybe the same thing or a step down from each other. It does raise the question, and every time someone claims to have a hair sample of Sasquatch and they run it through and they say, well, this isn't it's a primate, or it's this or it's that, or obviously this isn't Sasquatch because we come across this genome or that genome. It never seems to be a genome that comes across with anything that has a scent gland matching the scent that people are smelling.
Right. And so a lot of discussion has come up over the years about scent glands and Sasquatch, and no one has ever taken the time to really say, well, let's take a look at this. Is it possible? Does it happen? Well, the truth of the matter is that if Sasquatch is a mammal, it does have a scent gland. Human beings have scent glands, rather glands whose primary function is to release certain scents. The real question that we have to ask ourselves is if there is a strong smelling or voluntarily activated scent gland. So you have to, a lot of carnivores do have certain anal glands where they can actually expel certain odors. It's not as prominent in primates, however. Recent research, I'm talking about within the past 2 or 3 years, has shown that mountain gorillas can actually control certain scent glands on their body to function as a sort of secondary communication means within people in their within fellow gorillas in their troop. But still, that's not something that you see being used in terms of that skunk-like, deterrent in terms of keeping predators away. So you really have to sort of crack this apart and see if perhaps there isn't other supplementary evidence that suggests that this is a possibility. There is a loose trend where whenever people observe Sasquatch that do not appear to be aware of being observed, that they do not smell, which would definitely suggest that that perhaps they have some sort of control over this odor. But at the same time, there is a distinct lack of precedent for an actual controllable scent gland in a primate like that. There are certain primate scent glands that do serve certain functions, but they're not able to be released like a squid with its ink.
So it's projecting a little bit to say that this is a reality?
Well, I wonder. I think that it's a possibility. I try to be, again, in the spirit of agnosticism. I think that you have to engage a lot of different ideas. But what you really have to do is you have to look at one of four scenarios with something like Sasquatch, right? Mm-hmm. You have to say, okay, well, is this externally produced and deliberately applied to the Sasquatch? So, for example, does Sasquatch deliberately, I've heard this before, I address it in the book, does Sasquatch deliberately harvest skunk scent glands to rub on its body? You have to ask, is it externally produced and involuntarily applied? So is this just a byproduct of where Sasquatch tend to live? Like, the idea that the skunk ape of Florida just happens to live in these boggy, swampy environments, and that's why it stinks. Mm-hmm. Or you have to ask, is it internally produced and voluntary, which is the scent gland idea that we've been talking about, or internally produced and involuntary, just like a sort of body odor? And so you have to sort of examine what each of those might mean. It's interesting from the idea of, so a body odor that might be internally produced but involuntary. There is evidence to suggest that human beings, if we bathed as irregularly as other primates, we might actually be the smelliest of the bunch, which suggests that perhaps, there's been a lot of debate as to whether or not Sasquatch is an ape-like human or a human-like ape. Perhaps that sort of tips the balance in terms of an ape-like human, if they do have this strong smell that we would have as well if we were living out in the wilderness for that long.
I want to take a break here, Joshua. When we come back, I want to talk about UFOs and spirits, because there's the talk of some people never even hear anything when they see a UFO, much less do they smell anything. I want to talk about that. And you mentioned earlier about the different smells when it comes to spirits, both malevolent and friendly. So we'll get into that when we come back. The book is The Brimstone Deceit, an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas, available at Amazon.com. Is that one available on Kindle as well?
It is. It's actually available in a variety of other e-reader formats too that I can't remember, but it's available in quite a few e-reader formats. So a little bit of everything for everyone.
All right. Check it out on your e-reader format. When we come back, more with Joshua Cutchin right after this. Joshua, I teased it before the break. UFOs, you don't hear them coming, but there is certain smells you can smell as they are coming towards you. What exactly can you smell from a UFO? If you can barely see them and you can't certainly hear them.
Yeah, well, there are a variety of cases where people end up noticing a smell before they actually see the UFO. If people are outside of what appear to be structured craft, sometimes they will notice that sort of sulfur smell. Sometimes, in addition to like that hydrogen sulfur odor, they'll notice sulfur dioxide, which is that sort of gunpowdery smell. Sometimes they'll compare it to like sulfuric acid of some sort. But more common of the ones that I found would often smell ozone as well. Really? Which is the smell that you would associate with large electrical discharges in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. Ozone is probably the second most common UFO smell that I was able to encounter in the literature, and it's a very distinct smell if anyone has ever smelled ozone.
Yeah, I guess I associate it with a thunderstorm, but is it a lot like that?
Yeah, it's a lot like that. So it's a thunderstorm or the burnout of electrical wiring can sometimes generate ozone as well.
Okay.
What's interesting to me is that, I'm not a big extraterrestrial hypothesis guy. We've sort of talked about this.
Yep.
But if if UFOs do represent extraterrestrial craft, it's interesting to note that ozone has certain antiseptic qualities. For example, it's used a lot of times in municipal water supplies to actually sanitize the water in those particular neighborhoods. So it's interesting that perhaps this ozone smell is an effort to sort of cleanse the environment to prevent a world war of the world scenario for them.
Very interesting indeed. When it comes to spirit smells, we were talking a little bit about this too earlier. Of course, we get the typical demonic sulfuric smell we had talked about earlier, but one of the ones that always intrigues me, there's two of them. You hear, well, Grandpa used to smoke pipe tobacco or cigarette smoke. That one always intrigues me. The fact that when somebody smells smoke or cigarette smoke or pipe tobacco, it's automatically lumped in with a ghost. Why do you suppose? Why can't it just be that there might be some smoke in the area?
That's a great question. I'm so glad that you brought that up. So spirit smells in general, haunting smells, are pretty problematic because it's been demonstrably proven that certain environments can actually soak up odors and re-release them under certain atmospheric conditions like pressure and moisture and humidity, etc. Having said that, I do believe that there are genuinely some anomalous smells that people encounter with hauntings, but I have to wonder how much of these experiences we are perhaps interpreting incorrectly. What I mean by that is if you look at the most common smells that people report in hauntings or with spirit cases, it's either a perfume or smoke. And when it's perfume, it's almost always a woman. And when it's smoke, it's almost always a man.
Right.
But if you look at historical representation of gender between these two odors, there's no reason that we should assume that. I mean, cologne has been used since antiquity for men, and women used to smoke just as much as men in ages past. So I wonder how much sometimes people will probably misconstrue what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that I think that these sort of phenomena are in our heads, because I do believe that we are interacting with something objective, some sort of objective intelligence in all these sort of encounters. But sometimes I wonder how often our expectations color these experiences. A good friend of mine, ufologist Greg Bishop, has really sort of been talking about this idea of co-creation, that we tend to encounter these other intelligences of some sort, these other things, these other phenomena, and we meet them halfway with what we have in our own heads, culturally, psychologically, personally. And our expectations end up co-creating the experience with this other phenomena, and to sort of help us make sense of something that we normally can't understand. So I have to wonder if sometimes perhaps we really are misinterpreting these smoke odors as being masculine and these perfume odors as being feminine. Perhaps we're sort of shortchanging the actual reality of these phenomena.
Well, I guess I would pile on too with the question of, most animals, their sense of smell is such a defined, distinct sense that they can rely on it, that they use it for survival. Is our sense of smell almost so inaccurate that we can't depend on it, especially in an investigation?
Yeah, our sense of smell is pretty embarrassing when compared to canines, especially. For example, there's if human beings could smell at the same level that dogs could, we would be able to smell something like, I think possibly as high as 100,000 times, 100,000 times as accurately. If you were to sort of extend this particular motif to vision, a dog could see as clearly at 3,000 miles what we could see at 3 miles, at a third of a mile. So it definitely is something that the animal kingdom has a leg up on us. And I wonder sometimes if perhaps all paranormal phenomena release some sort of odor, but many times it's so far below our own human odor threshold that we don't notice it, but our pets do. And that's why you have pets seeming to react to non-existent paranormal phenomena so much.
Interesting indeed. I'm going to switch gears on you here. We've got about 3.5 minutes left, and we were talking off air. And again, I want to point out that Joshua Cutchin, our guest, is North Carolina born, Wisconsin educated, which I apologize to him for at the beginning of the hour, and Georgia transplanted. Now, I like to have fun with our guests and our listeners who are in Wisconsin. And I do it sheerly out of fun. I have relatives that live in Wisconsin, Joshua. And we have a friendly rivalry. They live in Green Bay, okay? Which, if you know anything about Minnesota and Green Bay, we have a friendly rivalry between our Packers and Vikings.
Green Bay,
you know. I have cousins all over Wisconsin. I worked in Wisconsin, sadly, for 3 years in radio. That's where I started my radio career. And I have plenty of horror stories about Wisconsin as well. Now, I like to make the joke that Wisconsin is full of Packer fans and serial killers. And it only gets backed up every time I make the joke. And I have listeners of the show who write me and say, quit picking on Wisconsin. But every time I say, see, serial killers in Wisconsin, you can't drive through Wisconsin without being scared. I get people from Wisconsin who tell me, no, it's nice and friendly over here, you know. No, it's full of serial killers. It wasn't just, you know, everybody's got a story about Jeffrey Dahmer or Ed Gein. And they say, no, we don't. You know, not everybody knows something about Jeffrey Dahmer or Ed Gein or has had an experience. But Joshua, you have a story for me, don't you?
Yeah, I do actually. I think this is probably the first time that I've ever told it on the air. I dated a girl for a couple of years up in Madison who said that her aunt was part of a church mission, and the mission at the church was they would go around to local insane asylums, and they would visit the people housed there, and they would sort of minister to them and you know, socialize with them as needed. And one time she was in Madison and had danced with this gentleman, this very polite gentleman who was very apparently very, very nice to her. And after she sat down after they had danced, she found out it was Ed Gein.
Checkmate, Wisconsin. Checkmate.
Yep. But I love Wisconsin. I love Wisconsin so much.
Doesn't mean you won't be made into human sausage, Joshua. Doesn't mean that at all. I'm just saying, Wisconsin. Everyone's got an Ed Gein story. Everyone's had a run-in with either Jeffrey Dahmer or Ed Gein. Just saying. And there's probably more out there. There's probably more. It's not a safe state, Joshua. It's just not.
It's the people who you haven't heard about their run-ins. That's
right. Yeah, that's the ones that are disconcerting. Joshua's books are A Trojan Feast, The Food and Drink Offerings of Aliens, Fairies, and Sasquatch, and The Brimstone Deceit, an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas. Both are available right now at Amazon.com. And on Kindle and other e-reader formats. Be sure to check them out. Joshua's website is also Joshua Cutchin, CUTCHIN.com. Be sure to check him out there. Joshua, thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
And thank you for being with us. Stay right there. Don't you dare move, folks. Coming up next hour, John Zaffis, Rosemary Ellen Guiley will be talking about Demon Haunted, true stories from the John Zaffis Vault. It's coming up next here on Darkness Radio. One. Welcome back. It's hour 2 of Darkness on the Edge of Town, Paranormal Radio Show. I'm Tim Dennis in for Dave Schrader. Just a reminder for you, darknessevents.com is where you want to go. There is a brand new Haunted Palmer House trip up there. Dave, myself, Bill Chappell, and a gallery session by the Michael Marty Perry. That's separate from the trip, by the way. But go to darknessevents.com, click on the banner, and sign up. Late February 2017 is when that trip takes place. Brand new workshops, brand new equipment, and ghost hunting galore that weekend. It's going to be a great weekend. Limited spots for that trip, and you're going to want to get in on it right now. Darknessevents.com makes a great holiday gift. And again, those spots are going to go here before the holiday season, so you're going to want to get in on it while you can. There's also single-day passes available, as well as just a few spots available left for the entire weekend. And, of course, hotel rooms are going to go to the people who have the full weekend passes. So you want to make sure that you're going to get those full weekend passes right away while you can. darknessevents.com. Let's get into our second and third hours here. I'm excited for our guests here, the second and third hours, and I'm kind of blessed to have them this Friday, and we're blessed to have them to cap off our week. Our guests for the second and third hour are Rosemary Ellen Guiley and John Zaffis, and when you put the two of them together, you're bound to get one hell of a book, and that is a pun, by the way. Demon Haunted, True Stories from the John Zaffis Vault is the name of the book. I tell you, leading paranormal experts John Zaffis and Rosemary Ellen Guiley have got together. They plumb the depths of bizarre phenomena involving demonic spirits, the restless dead, demon boxes, the jinn, 911, the World Trade Center disaster, relics, and more. And we're going to talk all about it tonight. Of course, Rosemary Ellen Guiley is a leading expert in the metaphysical and paranormal fields with more than 60 books published on a wide range of paranormal, spiritual, and mystical topics, including 9 single-volume encyclopedias and reference works. Her current work focuses on interdimensional entity contact experiences, problem hauntings, spirit and entity attachments, the afterlife and spirit communication, psychic skills and dream work for well-being, spiritual growth and development, angels, past and parallel lives, and investigation of unusual paranormal activity. She's worked full-time in the field since 1983, and of course, John Zaffis has over 43 years of experience studying and investigating the paranormal. He has had the opportunity to work for and with his aunt and uncle, Ed and Lorraine Warren. This has sent John beyond looking for ghosts and hauntings and into studying demonology under the Warrens. It's also led John into involvement with cases of possession and exorcism, which has given him the opportunity to work with prominent exorcists in this field, including Roman Catholic priests, monks, Buddhists, rabbis, and ministers. John's assisted and worked with well-known exorcists Bishop Robert McKenna, Father Malachi Martin, and Reverend June. His research has taken him throughout the United States, Canada, England, and Scotland, and he's covered several thousands of cases. Let's welcome them both to the Darkness on the Edge of Town Paranormal Radio Show. Rosemary Ellen Guiley and John Zaffis, welcome in. We appreciate you being with us here on this Friday night.
Thanks so much, Tim. It's great to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you both here. It's I almost feel it feels redundant to ask this question. But what finally brought the two of you together to say, you know what, let's take everything out of John's vault and True Stories and put it in book form? What discussion led to this?
Her threatening my life.
Was it really a threat, Rosemary? Was it a financial threat? Was it a physical threat? What took place in this whole deal?
Well, as long as John and I have known each other, which is quite some time now, we've batted around the ideas of collaborating on a book because both of us have such a wealth of material. And it just finally got to the point where if we were going to do it, we had to do it. And so John's not too far off the mark when he said it was a bit threatening. It was like, come on now, we've got to get to it. But pinning Johnny down can be very hard because he is constantly on the move. And while he was doing his TV show, he was just all over the place all the time. Mm-hmm. And I would find myself running after him with a digital recorder to note take for the book, and I spend a lot of time down in the vault, so to speak, with the artifacts. It was a fascinating process. It's always fun working with Johnny.
Well, John, let me ask you this. Rosemary brings up an interesting point. When it came to Haunted Collector and you being on the road and eventually that kind of winding down, when you come up to a kind of a point in the book where maybe Rosemary has some questions, or it comes to a point in the case where the two of you have to come together, it's not like you can stop filming and go, oh, you know what, let's put it on hold for a second here, boys and girls, and you've got to move forward with stuff like this. There's a lot to go through with your life. How long did it take you on your end to put together even the best and the brightest of your story to get this thing in motion?
Again, it's a fortunate thing working with Rosemary. Excuse me, because again, we do not live that far apart, Tim. There's a lot of times we can get together just on a telephone call saying, hey, you're around, can I come down? And vice versa. So for us, a lot of times it works out good to be able to get together. And Rosemary, with the wealth of knowledge and her understanding and her interpretations of, being able to figure out sometimes with me, as most people know, when I'm telling a story, I have a very bad habit of just, can you tell me? And I can give you one sentence and think I'm telling you the whole 4 or 5 pages. So, Rosemary a lot of times, can sit there and just hit the right things to ask to be able to get some of the information out, because it gets hysterical when her and I are sitting down, because she'll look at me and go, I never heard you talk about that before. I never heard this. I go, well, I just never think about it. But she has that gift to be able to bring things out, and I'm very comfortable. And, it's a relaxed situation because I'm not concerned or worried that things are going to end up, are misinterpreted or something, because, that is there where you could pick up the phone and we could call each other, or we know when each other's around, or we run into each other, when we're out on the road. I mean, even there's been a couple of times where, we're out lecturing or doing something, and then we'll just take a little bit of time and sit down and talk about things. So again, we're very fortunate in that way with being able to understand and comprehend things. Rosemary to me is a very easy read, and she'll start chuckling because she could sit there with a straight face, and I could come out with something, and I'll look at her face and she'll go, Tom, that makes absolutely no sense. But again, this is our second book together. I've been thrilled to death over it. The response, Tim, from a lot of the information and, going down that personal road with some of the stories and sharing more in-depth things, did actually work in our favor with this book. It really did. And it gave, the readers more of an insight, not only to John Zavis, but to Rosemary Ellen Guiley. Because, again, too, I've heard several different people, say to me, Rosemary was talking about this or talking about that, and, I'll stand there and I go, yeah, So it's an important element, I think, not only when doing something, but, the person you're doing a project with, that, you're able to communicate and have that personal dialogue that goes back and forth, because it helps a lot.
I got to ask you this, John, because it is important when you're putting your legacy on a page, when you're putting it in a book. I guess you do have the luxury of having a close friend who does know you, who can bring, as you put it, can bring that story out and put it so eloquently onto a page. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to play a little bit of a what if with you here. Mm-hmm. If Rosemary were not there, who would you trust to put your story on the page? Because it would come out more clinical if it weren't there. And I know that's important to have your story put out there, especially with the rich history that you have. Who else would you trust to put your story on the page if Rosemary weren't there?
Well, in all honesty, it probably still be sitting up in my head or down in the museum.
Which would be a shame if you think about it. I mean, but, and again, we do have the luxury of having Rosemary around and being able to be able to flesh this out. But it's, I guess I want to point out the importance of that there is that Rosemary is here and able to be able to get this rich information out of you. That's something that shouldn't be understated. I mean, a lot of people don't have the access to somebody who can get that resource out of them. I don't know how else to put this. I mean, it seems like I might be fawning over you guys a little bit here, but
you brought up a very good point, Tim. And John and I see this all the time in our field, just in our field. I'm sure it goes on beyond the field, and I'm sure other people feel the same, is that a lot of times writers are biased, and they have a specific way that they think a case or information ought to go, and they sort of shoehorn the data into their point of view. Whereas the point of view that I always take is telling the story. What is the story? The story has its own integrity, and tell the integrity of the story. And I think readers appreciate that. It's in terms of John and me sharing information, we've had complete trust in each other, and that makes a big difference too, because there's confidence in the finished product that it's going to have integrity, and we don't have to worry about something getting twisted or misrepresented. So we've had a very good working relationship, but that's been my approach to working with others and interviewing them. I used to work as a journalist, and I brought my journalism background into my present work in the paranormal. And part of my job in interviewing people is to let people tell their story and be true to that story.
Absolutely. Let's take our break here. When we come back, I want to ask you guys this scenario. You guys have also worked in the field together quite a bit. So I want to ask this question when we come back. Has it ever come up during the work in the book and Rose working with John, where maybe John's forgot one or two things about an actual investigation, and Rose has had to bring up one of John's investigation techniques in order to jog his memory? We'll find that out when we come back next on Darkness Radio. I might have confused you guys, but here's the deal. Okay, so as you're working on the book, John is, and here's the scenario. I'm going to set it up for you. So, Rosemary, you're sitting there and you're asking John about maybe a particular case, okay? And John gets stuck at a point where he's like, I'm trying to remember what I did on this. I'm not quite sure. And Rosemary, maybe you're familiar with his investigation techniques or how he investigates a case. And you would say to him, well, John, and normally in a case you would do this or you would do that. Did you try this or did you try that? Have you ever jogged his memory while asking him about an investigation that got him to move himself forward in a story? Or have you worked simpatico with each other in such a way that you were able to jog things out of his memory that got him to bring forward details in a story that maybe were long forgotten?
Well, I think that John probably knows a lot about some of the cases than he lets on in some public disclosures, storytelling. And there are certain standard things that you do in every case, so I can anticipate what probably happened. But I always like to verify. And so, yes, there are times when I'm asking a lot of questions about what happened and who said this and who said that and what did you do and what was the response, what was the activity. Because you just never know. You can't predict cases all the time. And that does then jog a lot of recall. Both of us do an awful lot of cases. And it's easy to forget some details sometimes. And it helps to talk to someone who can ask questions and, kind of pull things back out.
Let me ask you, John. Has there been an instance in the writing of this book where you're sitting down and you're talking to Rosemary and something has come back to you that you thought, wait a minute, I didn't, at first I didn't recall that this had happened, and it was a shocking detail, a particularly shocking detail.
Oh gosh, yes, continuously, and this is it's comical now, but Rosemary and I, when we do sit down, she makes sure she puts on her tape recorder now. Because when we start talking, Tim, and like Rosemary said, her technique, the way she does it, and it's, basically her job, because she's looking for the things that occurred, the things that happened. And a lot of times when you're sitting in general type of conversation, and, a lot of times she would ask me about this or that. Sometimes I start going in off a tangent, and I'll start talking about something else, and that's able to help Rosemary, as she's putting a story together. And many a times, and Rosemary will tell you this, that what she does is she'll say, come on, let's go down into the museum, and we just walk around. And I'll go, oh, yeah, this item here, this story, this case here. And Rosemary will stand there and look at me, and she goes, John, that's a fantastic case, a fantastic story. And she goes, I've never even heard you talk about it. Because, Tim, again, it takes that comfortability, to be comfortable and, to stand and talk to an individual about things that you normally don't bring out to the forefront about investigations. There's many that Rosemary or I do that we just don't talk about publicly because, again, respecting the privacy of families. But when doing that and being able to create the story and create different things, it's been something that I'm very glad that's occurred over the past 2 books, is to get some of these things documented and the experiences and some of the things that are up in my mind that could end up being lost in time. So it worked out, perfectly where it aligned where that time framing with putting the book together and creating the book. And, and I keep telling Rosemary this continuously, the feedback that we've gotten from Demon Haunted has been phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
Phenomenal at, what Rosemary has been able to capture and, putting into black and white, expressing the John Zaffis world.
Which is pretty crazy.
So this may seem like an odd question, but okay, so you've got this version, Demon Haunted, out there. Is this like and I'm going to draw a weird parallel here for you. You know how here in Minneapolis, Prince just passed away, and they talk about we don't know how many songs are in the vault, that there's endless songs in the vault. Are there endless stories between Rosemary Ellen Guiley and John Zaffis in the vault?
Yes.
Yeah? Is
yes.
it one of these things where we could do books and books and books?
Well, we're already working on the next one. And again, it's one of those types of things, Tim, where there's just so much, that I've been involved with or different things that I've done, and I just don't talk about them. It's with me, the stories, the investigations or the cases that, I've been involved with or things I've worked on. A lot of times they can go into being lost, in time. And her capturing it and putting it, in a book, has helped people. And to me, that's another important element, because there's a lot of different things that are intertwined with explanations that, as I would read the different chapters and go over the different things that, Rosemary would add from her expertise or things that she's been involved with or, different scenarios. And I'll sit there and, most people know I call her Ro. And I'll just sit there and read that and I'll go ahead, Ro, because, it's an important element. And I think it's helped people to understand some of the different scenarios, not just case-wise, but, from other things with interpreting things, because so many of us have a different version, a different way of looking at different things out there. So to me, that is an important element. But the vault, so to speak, is, again, I just take that step back and laugh because I can open a cabinet door or a file drawer or open something, and I could stand there for 10 days and just start telling you the stories on the things that are piled in those things.
So there's just hundreds and hundreds of objects, and not every single one is going to have a real dramatic story, but there are plenty that do. And one of the things that we also wanted to achieve with the books that we've done, Haunted by the Things You Love, which came out a couple of years ago, and now Demon Haunted, and the one we're working on, is not just to tell crazy stories and entertaining stories, but also give people some solid information and education about what's going on and how these things happen and how they can be dealt with. So there's multiple purposes here, and these objects in John's museum serve as very good focal points for a lot of teaching.
Well, let me ask you this question, and after this we'll go to our second break here. Is there a really true fear that not all of this will get documented in our lifetime? I mean, honestly, if there's this much out there, is time your enemy?
Well, from a writer's perspective, yes. I've written over 60 books. I like to joke that I came out of the womb with a manuscript in mid-progress, and I'm probably going to go out of this world with a manuscript in mid-progress. And my constant drive throughout my entire life has been getting it all done, and the to-do list keeps stretching on and on. And so I don't know if anybody ever gets everything done, but John and I have plenty of material to work with, and who knows how many books that we're going to be able to do. There's just a lot of new developments in the field too that can be addressed with the cases that we've worked on.
Right. John, is there enough time in this world, even working on active cases, is there enough time in this world for you to keep working on active cases, plus keep cataloging what you have?
Oh, yes. I still work on investigations. I still get involved, not as much as I used to. But again, I look at this as, the journey. To me, it's just a journey. And I can't take that step back and say to myself that, I would go out without enough being recorded or enough being said out there, because you just made me take a deep thought when you brought that up, Tim, which is a beautiful thing. Even though Ed Warren is no longer here, his stories still continue. There's stories coming out that, when they investigated, that no one ever heard about. So, again, into the detail, or a family decided to finally move forward with something. So I think it continues on, even though once we're no longer physically here, with different things coming out. So I look at it now as, if I'm out of here tomorrow, there's still a lot that I achieved, and there was still a lot that I got involved with and participated in. So I look at it more to this point that, I left somewhat behind. I left things, documented, and left things, to see if the stories carry on, and they usually do. I mean, throughout recorded time. And again, I look at it that, if there's, more to come as far as doing books or doing anything else out there, that'd be great. And I don't know. I just look at things very even keel on looking at a lot of it that I've already achieved.
Okay. When we come back, do you mind if we talk a little bit about Ed?
Not at all.
All right. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the parallels between John and Ed, and we'll do that when we come back here on Darkness Radio. You can look up Rosemary Ellen Guiley at visionaryliving.com and John at johnzaffis.com. And then people can get a copy of Demon Haunted True Stories from the John Zaffis Vault. Also at Amazon.com. And can they get them at the websites as well?
Absolutely. They can go to
on my website, it's a redirect to Amazon. It's available in hard print and ebook format. We also have an ebook format on Nook and Kobo.
Okay, sounds good. When we come back, we'll draw the parallels between John and Ed Warren. It's coming up next here on Darkness Radio. Our guest is John Zaffis and Rosemary Ellen Guiley. The book is Demon Haunted, True Stories from the John Zaffis Vault. You can follow the links from visionaryliving.com or johnzaffis.com. Before the break, we had talked a little bit about John's uncle, Ed Warren, of course, of the famous demonology duo of Ed and Lorraine Warren. And, John, you studied directly under your uncle and aunt, and I know you're very close to your uncle, Ed. And I'm just going to come right out of the box and throw it out there. You had mentioned in the previous segment that not only have those stories from Ed and Lorraine survived, but now they've been documented not only in books, but we've got the movies out there. Let me just throw this out there. I know I know the reaction of people, just lay people out there who are watching the movies. I know that a lot of people love the movies, but they're not necessarily accurate portrayals. They're based on the stories of Ed and Lorraine Warren. And I know in the book, in Demon Haunted, there's talk of communication from Ed from the other side. And I'm curious, has Ed said anything from the other side as to what he thinks of all the attention, first of all?
Well, be honest with you, I've never really, when these communications take place, with him communicating, going back and forth, again, here's a perfect example, Tim. You know, my uncle is no longer with us. He left in 2006. But look at the fame and the things that occurred after he's no longer here. You know, Conjuring 1, Conjuring 2, and, you know, Annabelle. Again, you know, with the accuracy of the movies, as we all know, and I think a lot of people understand it better today than they did in the past. When, you know, they're creating movies, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of things that get switched around for all kinds of crazy reasons that things are done. But, you know, like I've always heard, and we're always going to hear this, I mean, there's no one that's going to want to go sit in a movie theater and watch a movie for 2 hours that's boring.
Right.
So they're going to have things flying around. They're going to have people slammed against walls. They're going to have, you know, all kinds of the crazy stuff taking place. It's just, it's the nature of it, and it's going to happen. But I never really gave it too much thought, to be perfectly honest with you. Has he seen the movies from Beyond? I don't know. What does he think of it? I don't know. But I could tell you this is, as far as Conjuring 1 and, you know, the Perron family, that was a case my uncle talked about for years and years prior, you know, to it ever being created into a movie. And I used to hear him tell some of the stories and talk about some of the different things. So to me, it was very fascinating to actually see it, you know, turned in to something that's just going to go on forever and ever. I mean, Annabelle, we know, is totally way off base on what the original case was all about. You can't even compare it.
Right.
And, you know, Conjuring 2, a lot of, you know, controversy on whether or not my aunt and uncle were ever in the home. I can say, you know, I know they were in there. I know there was a lot of other people in there that investigated also. So how much time they spent there, I don't know. That was up 10 years ago. I wasn't with them, but I can remember him talking about that case and showing pictures of them being in there also. But, you know, it's like anything else. We get the controversy that ties in with each and every one of the famous cases that ever go into a book or any of the cases that turn into movies, that they get very controversial. And I think people understand it better today.
Yeah.
People say to me more now than I used to hear before. They go, "Oh, John, it's not factual. It's not factual." What I hear more now is, it scared the crap out of me. It scared me. So people are more interested in, you know, seeing it for it being more of something that's scary and frightening. And I'll tell you the same thing. I get the biggest kick out of it, too, when I'm sitting there watching a movie and I jump up out of my seat. You know, it's just the nature of us. We like getting scared when we go to see the creepy movies.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now, let me ask you this, John. What was Ed's attitude when you first decided you wanted to follow in his footsteps as opposed to now from the other side?
Oh, many years ago, with a lot of it, you know, he knew and he understood it because he's already been doing it. But when it came into me, I was, you know, especially at a younger age, extremely pushy, and I would go ahead and do things just like the younger group today in the paranormal, and, you know, try to comprehend and understand things. And probably the element, you know, because people always say to me, "Well, what was your favorite investigation?" That doesn't matter anything to me anymore. It was that time spent with them, driving around with them, going places, and things of that, you know, comprehension. Because I remember, as I jogged my memory, remembering just a lot of the talks in the car when it would just be the three of us going someplace. But in the beginning stages, it was all, you know, showing me things, understanding things, and then once I decided, you know, and I can remember it as clear as day. I said, I want to learn demonology. Ed and I were sitting at the kitchen table. Lorraine was over by the sink, and all I heard was, "Oh, dear. Oh, dear." Oh, like that. Next thing I know, him and I were down in his office. We sat there for a length of time, him just going in and just talking, you know, of all the different things that can transpire. Your life changes, and, it gets very isolated, and these things will occur and happen that you will never be logical to you. And he just went on and on and on, and I sat there and listened. And, he looked at me and he goes, do you really want to get involved with this? Do you really want to do this? And I said, yeah, I'm not worried about anything. Well, Tim, he leaned forward, crossed his arms, and looked at me across that desk. He goes, I am. He goes, you are my blood, you are my nephew, and he goes, you have no comprehension on what's going to happen. He says, because once it starts, you can't stop it. And then he had a very wicked sense of humor. Most people didn't know that unless you were around him and you would see him. And he goes, the one thing I don't want to have to deal with is my sister if something happens to you. And I can remember it. I just remember it as if it was yesterday. And I have to say, because I was in my 20s when I really started getting into the deeper end of the work. And, I can remember it as clear as if that transpired yesterday, that conversation.
I tell you what, John, let's take a break. When we come back, what does Ed think now of after 43 years, after all you've been through? What does Ed think now about John Zaffis and what he's been through and what he's seen and what he's done to help people? Our guest is John Zaffis, Rosemary Ellen Guiley. The book is Demon Haunted, True Stories from the John Zaffis Vaults. You can get your copy at visionaryliving.com or johnzaffis.com. When we come back, Ed's impression of John on Darkness Radio. And Ed warns messages from the other side for John, and we were talking a bit about what Ed thought when John wanted to get into demonology, and John's story about Ed's thoughts exactly of what he thought when he wanted to get into it. And John, the question now is, what does Ed think from the other side, and the messages from the other side from Ed, and what exactly is his impression now after you've been in it 43 years and have been helping people for 43 years?
Tim, I got to tell you, it's a bizarre and crazy twist, I feel, that took place. And here again, we go back to April of 2015. As most people know, I had a heart attack, went down, and a lot of things seem to have changed after that. And just leading down that road with a lot of different things, and I started discovering that there was a lot more communication with deceased loved ones that were coming through, and it started occurring with people that really didn't know me, and people would be doing different sessions, and I'd be there, and my uncle, Ed, would just come right out to the forefront and make sure everybody knew it was him, Ed. And everybody would just start looking at me, and they're going, it's saying Ed. I go, yeah, I know, it's my uncle. And he would just start coming through with a lot of messages and a lot of different information. And it took me time to process all this. Now, the reason I say it takes time to process it, do I necessarily always jump in right away and say, okay, hey, this is a deceased loved one, and, fall for the whole thing? Because we can be tricked, so you do have to be guarded and careful. I still look at it to this day with keeping my guard up. But it just got so intense, and it took me at least several months to come to terms with the simple fact that this was transpiring, and so many people were having these experiences because I don't go in to the environment of investigating and wanting to talk to my relatives. That's not what it's about. I'm there to talk to what's happening at the house, or communicating what's there. But it got to the point where it would just be out of control, and I reached a point where I didn't really know what to do about it, and I started talking to people. So it reached a climax where this one bizarre, crazy day took place where some of the researchers were up in Mystic, Connecticut, and then other friends of mine were up there, and I was going into a couple of towns over. We weren't even all supposed to get together. We all end up in Mystic at the old Mystic Inn, 15 of us, and they were having an issue there. I'm very good friends with the owners, and the whole communication turned into Ed, and there were 4 of us there at that point in time that were personal friends of Ed and Lorraine Warren. You could go hundreds of years if you want thinking about it. And the communication, the different things that transpired, I watched 3 other people, without me saying a word, react to what was coming through. I watched 2 women break down in tears on what was transpiring. And at one point, I just said, Ed, we're here to investigate the building. We're trying to figure out what is going on here. We're not interested in communicating with you. And 3 big bangs went right through that entire room. All 4 of us stood there because when my uncle would get frustrated or he'd get aggravated, he would bang on the table where he was sitting. And immediately the 2 women responded, and they're going, we remember him doing that. I go, I know. And he totally disappeared after that.
Wow.
He stopped communicating. Now, Rosemary and I kept going back and forth on, whether I really wanted to put, this level of my personal life out there or not. And Rosemary and I were working on a couple of things. And I said, Rosemary, I'd like you to listen to this tape. And I put the tape in. It was a 90-minute tape. I left my office so she can collect her thoughts. I came back in, and I looked at her, and I walked right back out. Came back in when the tape was done. Now, to hold Rosemary Ellen Guiley's attention to listening to a tape for 90 minutes told me something right then and there. And I've never really asked Rosemary, in as far as a personal experience or a personal level, what was going through her mind at that point. The only thing she said to me is she said, I just can't believe the amount of stuff that's on there and as clear as can be. And to me, it's extraordinary. It's just something that was bizarre because I had to sit and listen to it 4 or 5 times with some of the information that came through. But, I'd really like Rosemary to share her thoughts on what she was thinking and how, instrumental she felt that was at that point. Because the one remark she did say to me, because I was still up in the air, I was still going back and forth on what needed to go in there. And her being a journalist and, a writer, she said, this story has got to get out there. Rosemary, what was your thoughts that day?
It was mesmerizing and chilling at the same time. And we had already talked a little bit about Ed coming through with messages, and I had collected some information from people who had felt that they had had contact with Ed. But hearing this one particular recording was fascinating from a number of perspectives. One, I've done a lot of ghost box sort of work, and I've gotten a lot of weird communications and that can't be explained. They're usually very short, and they don't last very long, and this was sustained. The answers were very short in typical ghost box fashion, but the link was sustained, and the personality was very forceful, like Ed's personality was, and the voice was very distinct. So it just reinforced this building picture that Ed was making a concerted and sustained effort to get something across. And he was using the same words with a variety of people, words about letters, files, boxes, paying attention, personal advice for John. But some of the things were a mystery, like what book, what file, what letter. Was it a case? Was it personal? It was like a mystery that we had to find clues to solve, and we still haven't solved the whole mystery.
Interesting. Wow. I don't know what to say to that.
One of the weird things, Tim, was that Ed's post-mortem communications started with John and close friends like mediums and other paranormal investigators, and then just kind of exploded into people who really didn't know John, personally, that is, and also had never known Ed. Now, I did not know Ed personally. I met Ed and Lorraine, briefly years and years ago, and I had some interactions with Lorraine when I was working on, after Ed passed, for one of my other books. But people who had never, ever met them in person or talked to them would get messages from Ed. And one of the things I discovered was I was talking to a friend of mine, David Weatherly, who's probably been on your show, a good paranormal investigator. And I was talking to him about this case, and there's the silence on the phone, and he said, Rosemary, Ed's been coming to me since, 2015. And he had been getting ghost box and EVPs from Ed, and he didn't know why, but they were the same messages. And there's something leading up to a revelation, and we're not there yet, and who knows, we might crack it for the next book.
All right. Well, let's take our break here. When we come back, I got just one or two more questions about Ed, and then we'll go into some of the cases in the book. The book is called Demon Haunted, True Stories from the John Zaffis Vault. You can get a copy of it at visionaryliving.com or johnzaffis.com. John Zaffis, Rosemary Ellen Guiley are our guests, and we'll continue with them here next hour on the best in Paranormal Talk Radio. This is Darkness Radio. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the best in Paranormal Talk Radio, Darkness Radio. Tim Dennis in for Dave Schrader, who has a night off. Our guests are John Zaffis and Rosemary Ellen Guiley. The book is Demon Haunted, True Stories from the John Zaffis Vault. You can get a copy of it either at visionaryliving.com, Rosemary Ellen Guiley's site, or johnzaffis.com, which is John's site. Before the break, guys, before the top of the hour break, we were talking about communication you had from Ed on the other side, and you had mentioned the fascinating communication from him, and all it keeps running through my mind is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but you had kind of mentioned it's like you're being led along on a little bit of a mystery. Do you think that maybe Ed's doing a little bit of investigating himself from the other side?
Oh, absolutely. Again, my uncle, the personality, the way things are occurring, the way things are happening with this communication is the simple fact that he would continuously throw riddles out. He was that type of individual where, a lot of times you would ask him a question and he would just throw back a question or throw a riddle back out at you, and you would just stand there or just look at him and go, I don't even know what you're talking about, and then he would just smile. The son of a gun is still doing it. He just, this is him to a T, and you had to know him to understand it. And when I watch other people have these things occur and have these things happen, Tim, I don't care what I experience. I don't care what's going on. But people get the biggest kick out of it because him and I will sit there and start arguing, just like we did when he was alive. I would tell him to back off. I'll tell him, I'm trying to do an investigation. Then he'll get very huffy, and people are listening to it, and the conversation's going back and forth. And it's amazing to experience it because, again, and then people will walk away from that and just go, I can't believe we just went through that. And I'll go, what? And they're going, John, it's just like he's right there. And I go, well, he is. He's driving me nuts. With the continuation of the different things. But again, I think more so is that, Tim, it gets difficult for me because it's personal. When we deal in our work and we're working on cases or, dealing with families and things like that, it's a different feeling and it's a different vibration, if you will, when it goes very personal like that. And, having deceased loved ones communicate and come through with information, again, you take that step back. I mean, there was just one scenario where, it just, I totally lost it where this one a very good friend now, but in the beginning stages when Ed was communicating, coming through his box with information. I mean, he was just rattling stuff on about my mother, my father, my sister, all these different people. That just Mark Avina, he would not have this information. There was no way for him to ever have it, and it just led me to a point where I said, Mark, please just shut everything down because I lost it. Mm-hmm. And, we got quiet, and we were all just sitting around afterwards and talking, and he goes, Johnny, and I go, what? He said, I never thought I'd see a day when I'd seen John Zaffis ever get emotional. And I said, Mark, you don't understand. I said, you just brought up so many different things about my family life, my personal life with family here, that there's no way you would even know any of this. So again, why these things are occurring and they're happening, I think there's a bigger end that, just doesn't register yet with me. I don't think it's really something as far as me being in the work or dealing or carrying on. I've done that. I've been doing that. So there's nothing altered. There's nothing that's changing. But I think the bigger grand picture, is something else that he's trying to communicate. There's something else that he's trying to get across. And, as I look at it and I try to comprehend it, what in the world, in my physical world, in our physical world, what is it that he's trying to communicate? What is it that he's trying to get across? Because it goes way beyond. It goes way beyond anything, in existence now. And that's the way I interpret that. There's something else that he's trying to get across. And, as I go farther into it at different points in time, I pay attention to some of the other things that he's saying and he's coming out with, and just trying to loop it in and tie it into what it's all about. And again, I take that step back and I go, this goes way beyond anything that was in the past. This just goes way beyond all that.
I'm curious, John, when he would teach you things about the field, did he ever, you mentioned these riddles he used to speak in, would he teach you in riddles?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So as he's speaking to you in riddles from the other side, do you think that maybe because we're always told that when spirits speak from the other side, they can never reveal what's on the other side, or they don't ever reveal what's on the other side. But do you think your uncle would ever reveal secrets about the other side by speaking to you in riddles and hoping that you would catch his hints?
Well, Tim, that's the $1,000,000 question. And that's one of the things that, again, thinking on it and analyzing a lot of the different things that come through, because these are all the $1,000,000 questions that each and every one of us want answered. What is it like? What are the experiences? How do they see us? Where is this, big magical? Is there a big fluffy cloud with the golden gates? Is there a hell with brimstone and fire? We all have our theories. We all have our teachings. Mm-hmm. And we all keep hoping, that, eventually some of the information can be revealed. We don't know why we can't get anything clear-cut, defining all these hundreds of years of experiences and hauntings and everything. And is there a possibility? And I say possibility because I don't know, of him revealing something that we can comprehend, that we can understand. I don't know. But I know it's leading somewhere, and it's leading to a point with hopefully some type of discovery with something that's pertaining, to that spirit realm and to, how so many of us interpret these things with the spirit communications. So that's how I look at it. That's how I'm viewing what is transpiring and what is happening with this entire communication thing that transpires. Because I don't provoke it. I do not provoke within the realm, especially with dealing with any of my deceased relatives. Mm-hmm. I've never done that I don't have an interest in it with that, but he's making sure that information keeps coming through from a lot of different relatives and different things. And when I do ask a question, it's very, very seldomly I will go just so far and then I stop just to see what the responses will be. And I just that's been recent that I took that baby step, because again, being an individual, any individual, it's very difficult and it's hard with our loved ones. It's when those communications start that just solidifies an awful lot to us in our lives. But the one thing with all of this, with several of my family members coming through, it just, I look at that now as the simple fact that, these communications are occurring. They're happening. It's not something in all our heads, because I pay more attention to other people's experiences than I do mine. Mm-hmm. That's my verification that these things are occurring. What did they hear? What did they experience? And then when they repeat it back to me, I go, okay, it's not me reading more in to what's transpiring and what's happening. That's my verification. Now, at the end of this, what is the whole scenario going to be? I don't know. I still think it needs time to play out.
What keeps running through my mind, though, John, is why a man of faith whose uncle passed 9 years previous. Mm-hmm. Why does he need verification from his uncle? Why now? Why does he come forward 9 years later to talk to you and then bring relatives forward? Well, why? First of all, why do you need verification? Why do you need the messages? And why does he come forward so forcefully? Why now? Why all these years later?
Well, I think a lot of it, Tim, stems back to April of 2015 when I had the heart attack. Mm-hmm. Because that's when I started to notice things changing with me, and going into investigations and the information. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, there's been other scenarios where ads popped up, but everything just changed after that. And it took 2 or 3 months, of these things starting to occur when I got back to doing some investigations and doing things where that came to the prominence of the forefront. And the one thing that always still goes through my mind, and it's never going to change, is that I have been, around family members when, the time is at the end and they're preparing to go, and they start talking about all the deceased loved ones being around. Well, I was always a wise guy with that stuff, and I still am, where I would just say, oh, yeah, who's with you? And, listen to a lot of those things, and I would always say, well, I want proof. I want some type of verification that that's transpiring and that's happening. Do I feel at this point in time now that when that physical energy is departing the body or leaving the body, and there's some type of experience that each and every one of us has, whether it's a near-death experience or some type of major trauma, that it alters us? I always questioned that.
Yeah.
Now I don't. I don't question it anymore, because it came to the forefront, and it takes proof, with a lot of us, when dealing with these things, no matter how long you're involved with the field, where you take that step back and now something's different, something's changed, and you have to reevaluate it again. To me, that's our learning process, and it continues, and that's why I think, some of this has transpired, some of it's occurred, and looking at it and understanding it is just that process. Because as far as I'm concerned, still, like you said earlier, he's been gone, 9 years now. Mm-hmm. In the spirit realm, there is no time. So therefore, it means absolutely nothing to them. 9 years to us, wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But in the spirit realm, I don't really think it means anything. And again, they wait for that opportunity, whatever may come forth, and presenting information or presenting something to give us a better comprehension and understanding of something. And that's the way I view it and the way I look at it, at this point, and some of the information that comes through. And I just laugh when people just call me randomly and just say, John, Ed was around, and I go, oh, here we go again. But then when they start rattling off different things that they won't have any prior knowledge to, then I take that step forward and I'll go, okay, well, you must have been communicating with him because there's no way you should know any of that.
I'm going to ask you a little bit of a sticky question here, John. With the fact that Ed's been coming forward and your relatives have been coming forward, and it seems like that emotional layer has been peeled back on you now. Mm-hmm. Do you feel, and you know what you have to do to prepare when you go into a case with a malevolent spirit or a demonic spirit, mm-hmm. Do you feel with that emotional layer peeled back that makes you more vulnerable now to go into future investigations? Or do you feel with having Ed around you and these different relatives now around you and having had different things verified for you that it makes you stronger?
I feel at this point it has more so solidified within me. Has it made me stronger? Yes, for two different perspectives. One, dealing with the negative of it. Again, we all get laxed. We all get comfortable with what we do. And it's made my guard go up higher because, again, we know spirit can trick us. Mm-hmm. So I keep my guard up. And just moving forward, I feel with some of it, sometimes the information that transpires or some of the different things occur, I look at it as a collective. And when I say collective, what I mean is your environment, your surroundings, the people that are with you. I view that a little bit differently now, Tim. Because, again, yes, do I view and look at things probably a little bit differently than I did prior? Yes, I do. And it's something that I feel has helped me to gain a little bit more knowledge with trying to comprehend and understand, the whole realm that so many of us are involved with. We're trying to comprehend and understand what it's all about. So I look at it, from many different perspectives of all of this occurring and all of this happening.
Rosemary, let me ask you, I want to turn this to you for a second. After John's told you about this experience of Ed coming forward, have you seen the change in him, even from the heart attack to now?
Well, yes. And I think John touched on that in terms of his acknowledgement of the existence of these kinds of things. When they happen on a personal level, you can't help but be transformed by it. And it also causes you to kind of take stock of your life and where you're at and what you're supposed to do with yourself, how well you're sticking to the focus of what you feel the purpose of your life is. And in fact, some of the things that Ed has been saying might be addressing that, because in puzzling out what Ed has been referring to, we considered that if we couldn't find actual books, files, and letters, things like that, that maybe they were symbolic of something, and that they might have to do with John's work, his work in the field. There's something he needs to pay attention to, because the repeated message is that he has to pay attention. Mm-hmm. And they might even address some of Ed's feelings about the field in general. And, there have been problems. Every field has its problems. And demonology and the paranormal certainly aren't invulnerable to that. There's been an increasing emphasis on sensationalism, and some of that has been an impact of film and television. Audiences seem to think that everything has to be super scary now because that's been portrayed a lot. And so maybe this is all wrapped up in sort of an existential picture going on, where it's not just about John personally, but about a bigger picture. Some of the messages actually started shortly after Ed died, which is often very typical. That I do a lot of afterlife studies, and people will frequently communicate shortly after they've passed over, usually because they want the people on the who are still living, the loved ones, to know that they're okay. And if they can't get through to the key people, they will go to other people. I call them proxies, individuals who are in a position to relay messages. And one of those early proxies was a medium who's a mutual friend of ours, Lisa DeRosa Phillips, who started getting messages from John shortly after he passed, which were very similar to the messages that we're hearing from Ed today. Some of them also were personal advice for her in her cases, and some of them were personal messages for John that she was supposed to pass on to John. The interesting thing about Ed is that he's had now quite a few years of communicating off and on to people, and that's very unusual. People from the other side usually don't become regular communicators unless they might be working with a medium, for example. Mm-hmm. They pass to the other side, they get their closures and their farewells and their life advice messages through, and then it's not typical to hear from them again, especially on a regular basis, except maybe under certain exceptional circumstances. So Ed, perhaps because of the nature of his own consciousness and work and the fact that we're all in this work of reaching out into the other side, he's been able to build a very solid bridge of communication, which since John's heart attack has taken on a new urgency. And so that's a life-turning event, too. You have something that brings you right up to the brink of passing over. You can't help but be impacted by that in terms of re-examining who you are and what you're doing. And so now the messages since then from Ed have they've stepped up in frequency. They've hit a broader base of people who aren't personally connected to John, and they're going somewhere. It's an energy that has a drive and a focus, and we keep asking Ed, tell us exactly what you want us to address, and we're not getting a clear answer yet. It is not uncommon for messages from the other side to be rather veiled and sometimes vague. We don't really know how the communication bridge is constructed energetically, and it has its limitations. In fact, the dead will say from time to time that they have a difficult time communicating with the living because there are a lot of obstacles. So it is a big mystery what's going on. And my personal feeling is that it's driving toward a resolution and that there's a breakthrough that's going to occur. And we're hoping, one of the things that we discussed in our decision to bring this material forward is that we were hoping that putting it into a broader community for discussion will energize it in a way so that we can get that breakthrough.
Do you get the feeling, Rosemary, as you talk about how Ed is reaching out to people that aren't even connected to John, that in some way Ed's spirit is growing almost to a point where he's ascending past his own level, almost trying to get to that level where he's trying to become almost bigger than a spirit guide, where he's trying to get to a level where he can reach out and help others and guide others. You know what I'm saying? That he's trying to almost ascend and trying to help and become a mentor to others in almost a forceful way. That's the only way I can I guess communicate it.
Well, there is some merit to that idea. In fact, a number of the people who I interviewed who've had communications from Ed have had the impression that he is trying to assist them in their investigations, or that he has something that would be personally useful for them. Mm-hmm. Now, consider how Ed has gotten a lot of energy from the collective just on the basis of his he was famous while he was living, but he's even more famous now posthumously, thanks largely to the films. They've brought the Ed and Lorraine story to a huge audience worldwide, and that collective energy may be part of this too, in terms of enabling him to reach out to more and more people.
That's fascinating. Wow, fascinating indeed. I tell you what, let's take an early break here. When we come back, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the investigations from the book, some of the stories in the book, and talk about. I want to come back and talk about something both of you have a common interest in, and that's the djinn. I want to talk a little bit about John's experience with the djinn, and talk about where you're at, Rosemary. I know you have an entire book out there on the djinn, and it's a huge interest of yours. And I want to talk about where those interests intersect with the djinn, because that's a darker spirit that seems to be one that's hard to get rid of. The book is Demon Haunted, True Stories from the John Zaffis Vault. It's available at links at visionaryliving.com, which is Rosemary's site, and johnzaffis.com. And the link to Amazon.com to get that book is there. Again, the book is Demon Haunted, True Stories from the John Zaffis Vault. When we come back, we'll talk about the djinn here on Darkness Radio. United States. Michael and Marty Perry will be there as well. Tickets are going fast. You can get a full weekend event package and single-day tickets as well. Darknessevents.com. Our guests this hour are John Zaffis and Rosemary Ellen Guiley. The book is Demon Haunted, True Stories from the John Zaffis Vault. You can get your links to the book at visionaryliving.com and johnzaffis.com. The djinn, we've talked about them before on the show, and they're particularly frightening because they're not an easy malevolent spirit to get rid of. Rosemary, we've talked with you in the past about the djinn. John, I'm interested in your experiences with the djinn as well. Have you had much success in when you've come up against the djinn?
Well, the djinn is an extremely difficult situation to deal with. As we know, Tim, they pre-exist everything, and they were here before man was even, walking Earth. And I think one of the key factors with djinn, and it's just something that's always, this one story always sticks in mind, is Rosemary and I were sitting as she was doing her research and everything. She goes, "Gee, John, did you and Ed ever work on djinn cases?" And I looked at her and I went, "No." And I called her. Well, that happens a lot of times. I called her up and I go, "Yeah, we did." And she goes, "Oh," and I go, "He used to refer to it as genie in the bottle." Or and genie in the lamp. That's what he used to say. But I didn't connect it. But anyhow, yeah, and they're very difficult cases, very hard to work on. I think what really was the turning point, if you will, from dealing with it was going with Rosemary. She invited me to a location that she was researching, a farm, and experiencing and witnessing what is referred to as the djinn, because I had gone outside. I was out back, and there were these big 10-foot shadow figures, but it was different. The feeling was different. Everything was different. And I started viewing things and looking at things a little bit differently as Rosemary and I were speaking and we were talking about the djinn and getting involved with it. It gave me another realization, if you will, that when dealing with this, it was a very important topic. Now, the reason I say it's a very important topic, Tim, is that this is something I say to Rosemary all the time, is that, she will push it, and she will push certain topics and push certain things, and I would tell her, and, again, I would say, Rosemary, leave it alone. Don't go down this road with all this. Just leave it alone. Mm-hmm. But, again, it's something I revere about her and respect about her, and she said, she stood her ground, and she got that book out there. And now I look at it differently, and I say to her, I think that was a very key element and very important that she did that and she got that information out there, because it's able to help other people and get a better understanding of what I refer to as the demonology end of our field, with the comprehension and how we deal with certain subject matter. And the majority of the information was always out in that forefront about, deities and devils and demons, and the majority of us always just left that one particular topic alone. Knew it existed, dealt with it, and therefore, again, a very difficult topic. But again, looking at it and comprehending it and understanding it from Rosemary's perspective, I think that was one of the best things, to her credit, was getting that book out and doing the research and knowing some of the things that she dealt with and handled during the course of that, due to the amount of recognition being given to that particular topic.
Rosemary, is there a common type of haunting out there that we're mistaking for a jinn haunting in the Western world because of our lack of understanding of the jinn?
Well, they're all over the place, and I think that we do misdiagnose them a lot in a variety of settings. They never really entered Western culture in terms of knowledge and lore, and so we don't think about them, and it doesn't occur to us that some sort of paranormal situation might be due to them, whereas in other parts of the world, they would be immediately suspect. And people often ask, well, what's the difference? If you've got like a bad haunting, something that is creating havoc and might even be possessing someone, how do you know if it's jinn or demonic? And sometimes it is hard to know because they act in very similar ways. And it's only through a process of observation, interviewing, research, and trial and error with remedies that you might be able to discern the difference. However, and John can attest to this, that the case that we have in the book, which revolved around a farm, there is a distinct, different energetic feel to the jinn than there is to the demonic. And it's not something that can be described in words. It's like you're the tuner on a radio, and you know the difference between one station and another because of the frequency. And I think that that's a sensitivity that an investigator just develops over the course of time, especially if they are willing to open themselves up psychically. And the more you investigate, the more you have to do that if you're going to be very effective at it. You can't rely just solely on equipment. But they can cause hauntings, haunting phenomena, poltergeist stuff. They're famous for black shadows. I think the shadow people phenomenon is a jinn phenomenon. They will invade bedrooms and sometimes pester people sexually. Sometimes they'll assault them. They can be attached to land and literally haunt land. And so, like the fairies, they are sometimes not fond of people who come and build on their land, because then they will haunt what is built on their land. And they're very tenacious, and they have the ability to fake people out. Now, we find this in demonic cases as well, but I think that some cases we call demonic, they're really jinn cases. The jinn can be quite resistant to various exorcism tactics, and they have the ability to persist over long periods of time. They might be dormant for a while because they're outside of our time frame, and then when it's to their advantage, they'll act up again. If I had to describe some salient differences, our concepts of demons are that these are servants of Satan who are dedicated to soul destruction. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are these kinds of entities out there, but they're not the only kinds of demonic entities or dark entities. There are a wide range of demonic beings, and ancient people recognized everything from just kind of mild tricksters to the out-and-out terrorists. And we view them solely as the out-and-out terrorists, and there's a lot of other demonic beings in other parts of that spectrum. The jinn tend to be, from my perspective, what I've seen in cases, I would say self-serving, that they have their own agendas, their own ends. And that could be amusing themselves, taking the life force, playing with people, getting some kind of sexual satisfaction out of dealing with people. Some of them are more hostile and malevolent. They wanted to do destruction and damage. Some of them just seem to act out if their toes are stepped on. I think that's particularly the case in the land hauntings where people invade their territory, and like human beings would, if somebody came and started taking over your house, you would act out and fight back too. Mm-hmm. So things are not very black and white. In fact, they aren't black and white at all. And there's no one definitive explanation that just encapsulates and captures everything. They have the ability to shape-shift, and I do believe that they take many forms that we ascribe to mysterious creatures. They are involved in the ET abduction scenario. They can take the forms of aliens, and they participate in abductions. There are some researchers who believe that all aliens are just forms taken by jinn. And we don't really know where the boundaries are. Wow. We don't really know whether jinn are the Oz behind the curtain of everything, or if they're just shape-shifting kind of sneaky players in the big picture, capable of using other forms to masquerade and disguise for the purpose of their own agendas. But they have been around long before we came on the planet, and some of them seem to be very hostile to us. They're not all bad. Whereas we think of demons as being all evil, that's who they are. They're just evil. Mm-hmm. The jinn are more like human beings. The good, the bad, and the ugly. It seems, however, when it comes to interacting with them, we wind up dealing with the hostile side of them rather than the more benevolent side of them.
Wow.
So that's kind of it in a nutshell, but it's a very complicated picture. And one of the things that I found as I did more jinn research was that they're like an octopus with many tentacles that is spreading out in every direction. And everywhere, once I realized how much they were involved in all of our entity contact experiences and paranormal experiences, there was yet a new path to follow, that I couldn't seem to get to the end of the jinn mystery. They just permeated everything.
What a mess. That's not great. That actually gets more and more confusing, I guess, and more tangled. Let's take our final break of the program. When we come back, it's time to leave you scared and ready to go to bed, kids. We'll get one of John's scariest stories for you when we come back. The book is Demon Haunted, True Stories from the John Zaffis Vault. You can get a copy of it either at Rosemary's site, visionaryliving.com, or at John's site, johnzaffis.com. When we come back, we're going to put you to bed scared here on Darkness Radio. As promised, John, we got to send people to bed scared out of their wits. It's a tradition here on Darkness Radio. So I guess as promised, can you give us one of your scarier, we promised thrills, I guess. So one of your scarier investigation stories as far as the demonic go?
Well, again, dealing with that, Tim, it's always bizarre and it's always crazy. The one story that Rosemary and I decided to put in was my journey with Debbie and Larry Elward Larry is a non-denominational priest. And again, Debbie is very good at picking up on different things. We were working on 3 investigations at one point in time. And you were asking earlier, when we deal with a lot of these things, can they always be successful when you bring a spiritual person in to do an exorcism or, a clearing? No. A lot of times, it has to be repeated, and sometimes they just don't plain work, and sometimes you have to keep trying to figure out why. Well, the third investigation that we were working on, I still remember it as clear as day, and this was several years ago. I turned and looked at Larry, and I said, Larry, that exorcism was extremely quiet. Nothing has happened. There's no reactions, nothing whatsoever. I said, the past couple of ones have been awfully quiet. And he goes, yeah. And I go, I don't like it. I just don't like it. I said, it's not adding up right. And, the following day, I was at work, and something was bothering me, something terrible. I was like, something's not adding up right. And I just kept calling Debbie's number, kept calling. Then finally, later on, her daughter had answered her phone, and she said, John, my mom and Larry were run over by a car today. And, she was explaining the different things that transpired. Larry got hooked on the back bumper, and he got dragged, and Debbie got ran over 3 times. The both of them, extremely critical. They did not think Larry was even going to survive. And Debbie was in very rough shape. And again, it's a very difficult thing because I don't associate everything with the paranormal with occurrences that happen in our lives. But they were leaving church. They just got out of Mass, and they were getting into their car, and an elderly gentleman just happened to hit the gas instead of hitting the brake and didn't even realize he ran them over.
Oh, my gosh.
So, it was touch and go, but then Larry finally came about and everything, and I had walked into his room that day, and he looked at me and he goes, don't ever say that again. And I go, what? So it was too quiet. He goes, I remember you saying that. That was one of the last things I remember you saying. You didn't like it. You were concerned that something just wasn't adding up right. And again, do I associate and tie all this with dealing with this demonic stuff? Yeah, you never know. You never know what's going to hit you. You never know what's going to happen. How is it going to retaliate? Sometimes that's the chance we take when getting involved with this and being involved with these things, is that the end result is, what price does a person end up paying for getting involved with that part of the field?
Wow. Oh. I would ask you, I know, John, we've talked in the past privately, and you say, before you enter the house, you say your prayers, you leave it at the doorstep. But does that fear enter your mind often? A little bit?
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. I have to honestly say, again, it's something that you come to terms with, especially when we deal with the demonology end of this field. It's isolating. It targets you when you least expect it. You don't always, know what's going to happen, because it's just not going to come right out and retaliate standing there with horns and a tail and hooves. It's not how it works. It's not how it gets you back for trying to help individuals out there. So again, when you take that step back, you realize a lot of it. You know what's happening, and it's probably, a key factor in it that a lot of the people that are deep into it and involved with being in that part of it, a lot of us are very quiet with a lot of the things we get involved with. I just don't talk about a lot of the cases and a lot of the different things that occur or happen. It's very isolating, and it's probably the best way I can describe it with dealing with that whole part of my life. I mean, you've been around when I've been speaking and different things like that. I only go so far, and then I just leave it alone. Mm-hmm. So again, that's, to me, you don't know. You don't know when it's going to strike. You don't know how it's going to strike. You don't know how it's going to end up affecting you in one way, shape, form, or another.
I tell you, our time is short here, but I got to ask just this one question here, and with I'll give you about 30 seconds to answer it. With a huge paranormal museum, obviously you're collecting these evil objects and putting it together too. Does that add a little bit to the fear factor, or is that just, you know what, I got it all corralled in one spot, and to me that gives me a little bit of peace of mind too?
Well, again, my guard is up all the time, regardless of having this collection of the different things from, human spirit to things that have been used in rituals and everything. There's bindings, there's prayers, and there's always things that are done over the items. But it's a part of my world. It's something, I've dealt with, for many years. So, again, it's just something that I get used to. When there's activity and things like that, I don't pay attention to a lot of it. Other people pick up on things immediately, and I'll just stand there and go, okay. And they'll say, John, don't you have activity? And I go, yeah, but I just don't pay attention to most of it. I just don't. And again, the barn is separate from the house. Mm-hmm. None of these things are in my home. Trust me, the things and me would be out the front door. But again, it's part of my world, and it's just stuff that I'm used to dealing with after all these years.
Right. Demon Haunted True Stories from the John Zaffis Vault is available now. Go to visionaryliving.com, which is Rosemary's website, or johnzaffis.com. Follow the link and get the book right now. John Zaffis, Rosemary Ellen Guiley have been our guests. Thank you both for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, Tim. Thank you so much.
And everybody, have a great weekend. Dave will be back on Monday. Of course, Parashare and Supernatural News on Monday. I'm Tim Dennis for Dave Schrader. Have a great weekend, everybody, and thank you for listening to the best in paranormal talk radio. This has been Darkness Radio.